Welcome to AntKast by Ant Group. It's a podcast that brings you deep into conversations with global thinkers, innovators, and entrepreneurs on groundbreaking technology and how they're shaping our lives for better or for worse. I'm your host, R.T. Warfield. As the festive time of the year approaches, I believe there are many in our audience who are preoccupied with the shopping that accompanies it. So, in this episode of AntKast, we're talking about the holiday shopping season and what it means to both retail and the global supply chain. According to the National Retail Federation, over the last 5 years, holiday sales accounted for nearly 20% of yearly revenue for U.S. retailers. It is the most important time of the year for them. Despite the pandemic, holiday sales are predicted to grow by 8.5% to 10.5% this year over 2020. Also due to the pandemic, the retail industry has experienced seismic changes. Last year, according to Salesforce, digital sales during the holiday season have increased 50% globally. So, are there any new hidden trends in retail? And what does this all mean for consumers? To discuss this and more, we are joined by global retail expert Deborah Weinswig. She is the CEO and founder of Coresight Research. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here today.
Thank you. So, as you know, and as many of our listeners know, everyone is being consumed by holiday season shopping. And so I want to know from you, since you're a retail expert, what kind of holiday shopping have you been doing? What kind of items have you been purchasing?
So it's interesting because we always like to think of ourselves as individuals, but when you actually look at the data, we all find that we're consistent with the trend. So this year, I actually bought a lot more on the electronic side. So I bought new AirPod Pros and also some other, I got a new phone and a phone case and a screen protector and a camera protector. So yeah, it's all been, and that's what also from a gift perspective, it's been much more kind of electronics driven. And that is quite consistent with the trends that we're seeing as well, especially around kind of Cyber Monday and even on Black Friday.
I see. Well, I had heard that, there's been this pent-up demand, and also, because of the pandemic, people were not spending so much on services, so they had a little bit more disposable income, and now they're spending it on actual goods. Is that the trend that you're seeing?
It has been interesting because I would say the biggest surprise to me during the pandemic, or let's call it the crisis, because we're, I guess, technically still in the pandemic, is that we saw this huge increase in jewelry sales. And if you think about it, right, when you're on Zoom, you can only see kind of like from shoulders up, really, depending on how your camera's angled. And so as a way to kind of differentiate, right, and you don't want any kind of apparel that's too busy, because it will distract. And so we saw as a huge uptick in jewelry of all kind. And this whole idea of, kind of being able to distinguish oneself or whatnot. And that I think we've actually had companies who are kind of in the jewelry business who've had challenges in some cases actually producing enough, especially with some of the supply chain issues that we've seen. And so they've gone to 3D printing. I mean, we could spend a whole podcast talking about jewelry, which, maybe that's in our future. But that has been, to me, the most interesting trend. And I keep thinking, right, if I went back to, kind of, let's call it, mid-19 and somebody was kind of laying this out, would I ever think that jewelry would be a top trend? I would not. So I'm even if I, but it's been interesting. I mean, there's been so much, and I know we'll talk about it today, but just so much that's been, kind of different than what retailers and brands and consumers would have expected, which is, of course, why we're here today. But it's been really fascinating, and I think we continue to learn every day.
So, the pandemic has impacted retail sales in many ways. Are there any other surprises to you besides the jewelry component?
We would have expected, I would say we would have expected to see greater increase, I think, in demand for, if you had a computer at work and now you needed a computer at home. What we ended up seeing is many employers, very quickly pivoted to either shipping electronics to their employees. They were very, I have to say there was a lot of speed that we haven't often seen. And so I think there was, from a sales perspective, I would have expected in 2020 greater sales of all things kind of electronics than we actually did. And then number two, the other surprise, which was kind of in a different vein, I've been very surprised how quickly everyone was able to kind of spin up, BOPUS curbside pickup. But this idea of being able to get the consumer the good, however, the consumer is the most comfortable to receive it. And, and I think that's changed everyone's expectations around time and, product availability and whatnot. So I think it's also raised the bar quite a bit.
Now, for the world, globally, China produces 84% of all festive goods. They're all exported from China. And within China, 80% of those goods are produced in this one town. So in 2020, the number of those goods that they were producing were in half from 2019. But this year, the orders have rebounded 30%. However, most of the companies there have just said, we're not taking any more orders because, again, back to supply chain issues. So do you know about the town Yiwu? Have you ever heard of it?
I do. I had the opportunity to visit, and, I felt last year, right, in 2020, that, there was such a huge demand. It was fascinating, right, for decorating at home. Because that was kind of our world was like our home, right? The inside of our home and the outside of our home. And so, we saw like just tremendous, I would say, really, the consumer thinking about that. And I felt that the city, right, their level of importance last year was at a level that I'd never seen. And then this year was interesting, even talking to retailers. Right, they were actually talking about, we're like, we got to get to you before, kind of like before everyone else does, because they had predicted a lot of these shortages kind of coming into play, and this, it was very interesting because they were already thinking about what intelligence they could, kind of provide to the town, also even just kind of making it more real for them in some ways, and they were saying, maybe we should be writing, kind of letters to, having some of the letters for Santa going to you. I mean, it's been really interesting how the retailers have thought about it as well, and really understanding the importance of this city, right? It's not like they refer to it as a town, but I don't consider a city of 1.2 million people as a town, but maybe in some way. I mean, but it is funny. Retailers like, there's this like little town in China. I'm like, a little town of 1.2 million people. But I think that there is a responsibility in a way that, that is taken very seriously, because you're really creating Christmas for people around the world, and that is, and with supply chain challenges, and we've seen, we've talked to retailers who are like air freighting, kind of tinsel, right? And when you think about that,
wow, air freighting tinsel,
yes,
that's a first for me. Wow.
Yes, well, but it was actually really interesting talking to them, because this whole idea, right, if you don't even have like the basics in stock, right? You didn't want to create, and I think we had all been there, right? You wanted to keep the consumer in a place where they knew that you had stock, because then they were going to kind of come to you first. And this idea also, I think that it, considering what we knew from, just how difficult this all was, and I think the magic, right, that the retailers have put on this holiday season, I don't even know if they realize it, was not creating like panic buying. Because I will say there are many conversations I had with, whether it was economists or strategists or whatnot, and there was a real fear that because of some of these shortages, that we were going to start to see, there were folks who were predicting like panic buying of like, things like wrapping paper and whatnot, and we've seen kind of absolutely none of that. I think that the way that the retailers have worked with their global suppliers, and I think he was a great example, and how they have, really kind of been early. So
I guess the pandemic maybe is forcing retailers, like you say, to be more agile, to be quicker, to change, to react. So are you finding that all of them are able to do this, or this is like the pain point? If they're not agile, they don't react quickly, they're not learning fast, is this going to be an issue for them?
It's interesting. We actually wrote and we're not usually quite so bold, so I have to say I was quite proud of Coresight for this, but we published this kind of dear department store letter. And the kind of crux of it was don't feel pressure, or don't make a decision that might have longer term implications that you're not thinking about around spinning off your e-commerce. And, what I have to say, some of what it was really interesting how the letter kind of came out was basically like, you need to understand new retail, right? And embrace it and know what that means in terms of your business. And I have to say, I think the biggest, I look at there's 4 channels. So I look at there's stores, there's e-com, there's live streaming, and then there's like instant commerce. So this idea of instant commerce being 30 minutes or less, I want to be very specific about how we define that. But I look at all of that under this kind of, whatever, it's just retail. And for retailers to start to try and divide those pieces apart, I think is something that is a challenge for them. And so this idea that, we're just looking at, serving the customer, and, great customer service is at the forefront of everything they do. And so when you have, it's not even size, it's more mindset, right?
Now, I want to back up just a little bit because you've mentioned a couple times live streaming retail, and I don't want to make the assumption that everybody understands what that is. So my understanding is, it's referred to as live commerce, right? Which basically links up an online live stream broadcast with an e-commerce store, and then allows viewers who are watching to shop at the same time, right? So this is something. Go ahead, you tell me what you think.
I will actually correct you. When you look at the umbrella is live selling. And then underneath that umbrella, you have live commerce, but that's one-to-one. And actually, that's a whole nother conversation, but actually one's incredibly important. So in the early days of the pandemic, right, where, I would say live selling was but a dream for many, we saw, especially at the luxury side, and in some cases it was done over Zoom. There were, going back to from a technology perspective, there are a lot of startups that have now put together, technology solutions for you to basically have the consumer kind of dial up to be able to engage, with a live person, to be able to see everything. And so what they can do, there's brands like Nike and American Eagle who are doing this. It's in the news. And so that you can, as a consumer, then actually see the product, and you can have them try it on. You can, kind of shop, right, in a very kind of broad manner. And so to me, this democratizes shopping. So let's say, maybe you're a PWD, a person with a disability, and it is challenging for you to get to a store. Now you can get to the store and you can get one-on-one service. And, if you're maybe in a smaller town or whatnot. And so I think that there's, some amazing things, and you can get great customer service. That to me has been amazing. But then on the other side of it, right, when you have live streaming, right, that's like one-to-many. I mean, hey, you can one-to-many through Zoom. Typically, right, you will see a, kind of a retailer, and what we found to be most successful is when they use a sales associate. So this whole idea too, there's a whole other career path for sales associates. It's like professionalization of sales associates.
I was going to ask you about, television shopping, like QVC, for example. Like when I was a kid, I'm showing my age, but in the 80s, QVC, we all 1 a.m, you're watching this. I mean, it was a precursor, right, of live streaming, right? So I wanted to find out from you, what is the difference, between that kind of selling to many on QVC versus, what you're talking about online? I
think that, if you think about kind of QVC, it's always been, which I guess is now Curate, right, has been very, very much a playbook, right? There's a certain way that you sell, and it's all kind of very much like a magazine in some ways, right? Like the magazine come to life, right? It's very perfect. Everything is laid out in a certain way, and there's no mistakes. I mean, to me, the best thing about live streaming is the mistakes, right? Someone drops something, they say the wrong brand. That's why you always really need 2 people on a stream, just to kind of pick up and correct. But right. I think it's
more real, less polished, more real.
It's human, right? And I mean, hey,
human. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen kind of people on live streams just go off on these tangents, and I'm like, it's like the best part of my day, because I'm like, you know, and you know, there's a few of them that I'm particularly passionate about, and I love it when, you know, kind of people are like going through warehouses and like digging out product, and you know, I'm like, this is because I'm like I feel like I'm on this journey with them, and then it's for sale, and like, you know, and like you'll ask the you know, kind of creator or the influencer, like, you know, what do you really think about this product? And they're like, no, I wouldn't buy it. And I'm like, this is great, right? Because now I'm really relying on them. I mean, on QVC, nobody's ever, right, you know, gonna say don't buy this, right?
No,
and I think it goes back to, right, it's more about them as right there. They are connecting with you on like a human level, not on like
it's a stronger connection, is what you're saying. Like
that's exactly.
Kind of,
I think
right.
It is a stronger connection, and I think it goes back to like that's all what we need right now too.
Well, that is absolutely fascinating. You were talking earlier about, you know, the impacts of the supply chain. So, you know, like right now, you know, we're reading all these headlines, you know, like that Christmas is going to be more expensive this year due to higher inflation. Yet, despite the higher prices, as you were saying, there's like really strong consumer demand in most of the developed world. So what part, if any, do supply chain issues have in the inflated prices vis-a-vis strong demand? And do you see this as a temporary issue, or is this something more long-term in your view?
I do not view this as temporary, because so many of the things that are driving inflation, right, in terms of input costs, et cetera, those are not going to abate for quite some time. And, you know, I sit on a few retail boards, and if you look at the cost of cotton, you know, it is up, you know, right now, I think as of a week ago, up 30+% year on year. And that is, you know, we're using actually, so it's funny, we used to use organic cotton, and now we're like looking at recycled cotton, which I actually think from a consumer point of view, right, recycling is really critical, and there's a shortage of organic cotton as well. And so I mean, you look at raw materials and kind of across the board for many reasons, right? There are limited quantities, and so the input costs are up significantly. Then we have a labor shortage on a global scale, and so labor costs are up significantly. What to me was fascinating, like I'm a very much data-driven person.
Right.
If we look at Costco's November sales report, right, which was up double digits, half of that was inflation. I mean, half. So that is, but I also feel like, you know, the consumer, right, there's been no shortage. I mean, right, front page of the Wall Street Journal that I read this weekend was about inflation. And I think that the consumer, and they're also aware not only that it's happening, but why it's happening, right? Because of supply chain. So it's not that the retailers are trying to kind of, you know, angle an additional, you know, kind of penny out of this transaction. It's they're trying to cover their costs, and in some cases, right, they themselves are even kind of covering more of the cost, and they're passing on to the consumer. And so, to me, if we really take two steps back and look at what's happened this holiday season, we've had a lot less product, a lot higher margins, and to me, it's been the most sustainable shopping season we've ever seen. And I do hope retailers take a step back.
That's fascinating.
And think about
That's fascinating. That's so fascinating. There's a lot to learn because things are happening so fast. So you have to catch up and keep up on all the data, as you say, coming in. It's fascinating. So I'm wondering, you had mentioned earlier, the online retail avenues. Do you think are they more resilient to these impacts of supply chain in comparison with traditional retail, or does it matter?
I think that if you're a D2C brand, right, direct to consumer, and you began your life online, you probably have a different kind of tech stack than those retailers who started in the physical world and then entered the, kind of, let's call it the e-commerce, they went from analog to digital versus digital to analog, if you will. We've seen an incredible, so going back to, I just want to take a step back. So, right, we have jewelry that surprised me. And then, right, we were at incredible numbers of store closures. And who would think that a pandemic would actually fuel less store closures? Not me. And so that also has been
Whoa, hold on. Can I stop you? What do you mean?
Stop.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
what does that mean? Explain that to me. What's going on? What's the
what we've
numbers?
seen is that, right, as D2C companies have started to, right, really figure out how important physical stores are because of BOPIS, curbside, and pickup, right? And that the consumer, they want it right now. And they also want to have, and they do want that kind of personal connection with the brand or the retailer. So they do in many cases, they do want to kind of go in and kind of pick it up themselves and to engage with the retailer. And hey, maybe they want to like pop in and kind of like see what things are new. And so between that and the SPACs, right, which have kind of really been a backstop to a lot of bankruptcies, we have really seen a physical landscape from a mall perspective that I would never have expected. And you're not going to actually believe this. I just pulled the data as of Friday. So U.S. retailers have announced 5,090 store closures for those companies we track, which is like the 400 largest, and 5,070 store openings. So we're at like, ceteris paribus, basically, right? Like all things being equal, we're at about the same. And that is unbelievable as far as I'm concerned. And it really says something in terms of kind of where we've been, where we're going, and the importance of I would say physical retail, but almost in some cases, right, physical retail is ending up to be kind of almost like a warehouse, if you will, right? Because we are seeing stores, right, deliver and take on a different shape in terms of what the consumer expects also when they go to the store. So I do think what's challenging sometimes is, kind of online versus offline, is this expectation around, kind of product availability in a physical store. And, some of these online merchants, I think they've thought about that in a different way than those retailers, kind of who started physical and then moved into, kind of online e-commerce. And so I do think that that's where some of the differences lie. But, it is really quite spectacular, the number of openings that we've seen from, those companies that, started off, digitally native. And, and this is one other thing to take a step back and think about, that mall real estate is still less expensive than industrial warehouse space. And so it's, I will tell you, I predict in a few years that we see some of these malls turning into, ultimately warehouses. And as of right now, you are closer to the consumer and it is cheaper space. And so, there are going to be retailers who are going to kind of take a step back and really think about that. And what does it mean to be a physical retailer in this day and age?
Right.
Because I think it's different than it was 24 months ago.
As a lot of people know, retail is a very, very low margin sector. So, are there any trends in the future where retailers can find new ways to monetize what they do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, of course, what we've seen over the past 2 years is that retailers have really started to think differently about how they do everything. And the relationships, right? We talked earlier about the relationship between the retailer and the landlord that has changed significantly, but also the retailers and the brands. And what, I think the brands have realized is how valuable this space is on the retailer side. Now, that can mean two things, right? That can mean physical space or, the digital space, if you will, this whole idea of like the digital shelf. And and this allows retailers to, kind of get, it's called retail media, but they are allowed, if you will, and I mean allowed by permission, to ask for, kind of a fee to be able to advertise, if you will, for the brands. And this is, kind of starting to create some really unique relationships and also revenue streams for retailers. And so that's one area. The second is this idea around how do they, kind of monetize the data that they have. And they could be, especially if they are vertically integrated and kind of seeing what's, some of the trends in their factories with regards to, demand, if they're looking at, kind of what's selling and, what does that kind of indicate to them about the consumer. But this whole idea of, kind of anonymizing and then, kind of selling. And then, something that, we wouldn't have really even been talking about a year ago is this whole idea of the kind of metaverse And, retailers getting into NFTs. I think for Double 11, we saw like Burberry and Longines. We've since then seen, kind of American Eagle and Macy's with some really kind of interesting steps in NFTs. And that is a completely new revenue stream that didn't even exist, a year ago. And so I think that these are just a few ways of, actual monetization. And then we're seeing new ways of selling too, right? It goes back to whether it's, kind of live streaming, which we expect to double in 22, or instant commerce. And so this idea that this hyper-local approach to the consumer that we've never really seen before. So I believe that the year ahead will hold some really, I would say, gargantuan, which is not a word I use much, but changes, right, for retail. And that's around monetization, and it's also around their relationship with the consumer in terms of how they get product to them. And I think they'll learn a lot along the way. And I do think, sustainability is going to continue to be an even bigger topic. And, this idea that, whether it's Wall Street or consumers or employees, they may start to ask, kind of retailers to put some numbers around what they're doing in a way that we haven't seen before, so that the consumer can make a decision on who to shop based on some kind of scoring.
Well, it's interesting and scary, and actually it sounds very positive because, I think most people reading headlines, listening to the news, think, oh, the retail sector is, really struggling. There's so many issues, and a lot of the things you brought up in this podcast just totally blew all that out of the water. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of changes, but I think the important thing you're saying is they need to be agile and they need to communicate well with their customers.
I think the communication piece is, I don't even think I can overstate that if I tried. I think that will, those who can figure out how to have that communication channel, and whether that's, kind of live streaming, or whether that is like post-purchase, kind of opt-in text, or whatever it is, I think that there is an element there unlike anything that we've seen. And, as we're starting to see retailers get more into healthcare and mental health and whatnot, I feel like there is a whole other, that's a whole nother, kind of opportunity. But, this idea that they can also potentially address things for consumers before maybe even the consumers realize it about themselves is really quite exciting.
Deborah, I cannot tell you how fascinating this has been. I've learned so much from this conversation. Wow, if you could see my eyes, nobody can see on a podcast, but I was like one thing after another. I learned so much. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I really do appreciate it.
No, it's been really enjoyable, and I think that all of us kind of spending time, asking questions, being curious. And, I think this whole idea of, there are no real mistakes, right? And even, like I said, even if you're in a live stream and you say the wrong brand, it's okay, because there's somebody else there who's going to step in and really have your back. And I think that is going back to this holiday season, right? There's all kinds of ways to create the magic, and, but we have to do it together. And I think that to me is what's most important.
That's perfect for the holiday season. Perfect message. Thank you so much. That was global retail expert Deborah Weinswig. She's the CEO and founder of Coresight Research. Thanks again, and happy holidays, Deborah.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this edition of AntKast. So you do not miss a single episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, R.T. Warfield, coming to you from London. Thank you for listening. Talk to you again soon.